Today I'm going to teach you guys how to take a basic picture of a room for perhaps real estate agents or Airbnb owners. The first thing you're going to need, of course, is a camera, preferably full frame, but today we have a crop sensor. You'll of course need a very sturdy tripod. I'm using a Manfrotto today, but you can go a bit cheaper, but I really wouldn't recommend that. Of course, if you don't have a very expensive tripod, I'll show you a couple of techniques to work around that. We're going to be doing compositing and HDR editing in Photoshop afterwards, so you want your images to be aligned. Next thing you'll need is a wide angle lens. On full frame, you'd probably want something between the 16 to 24 millimeters. On this crop sensor Canon today, I'm using the 10 to 18 millimeter Canon lens. On Micro Four Thirds, you're going to want to divide that number by around 2, so that will be around 8 millimeters to 12 millimeters on the Micro Four Thirds. For the crop sensor Nikons and Sonys and so on, you'd probably use something close or very similar to this Canon 10 to 18 millimeter.
Right, so the first and probably the most important step in taking one of these pictures is, of course, finding your composition. We have a couple of features in this room that I really want to include. There's a
bathroom over here in front of me, cupboards to my left, there's a door and a window and a door over here into the rest of the house. Without any further ado, I'm going to see what composition suits me best. I'm really liking this angle. I'm able to include both the cupboard and the bathroom in this picture. Unfortunately, I'm not getting this door, but the most important features to me seem to be the bathroom and the cupboard for the purpose of selling this house. If I were to only take one picture of this room, this would definitely be my angle. Unfortunately, this bed is not in an optimal position right now. Neither is this little drawer over here. For me to be able to put my tripod back here, I'll definitely need to move this drawer and definitely move this bed. Because we're using a wide angle lens, this bed is massive in the frame. So my assistant and I are going to do some rearrangements in this room, something which is very common for this kind of photography. Alright, so the final part of getting your composition is establishing the right height. So you don't want the camera too low as to distort the bed even more, nor do we want to see the bottom of these top drawers to my left here. And I also kind of want to see the top of this countertop. It really creates depth to your picture. After that, we have to, of course, set our exposure. Because we're using a tripod, we can generally crank our shutter speeds to ridiculous numbers, leaving the camera there for maybe 1 second or sometimes even more to take a picture, so you don't have to worry about blur. Also remember to put your stabilizer off. That's really going to improve your picture quality if you have a lens with image stabilization if you're using a tripod. Next, we need to set our aperture. Generally in real estate, you want everything to be in focus. You'll be fine with using an aperture of f5.6 with a full frame camera. When you're using a longer focal length, something like 16 millimeters, I would generally stick to something closer to f7.1. Everything should be in focus at that point. Of course, you want to focus on something in the middle of your frame, so everything around it is in focus. You don't want to focus on something too close or something that's too far. So with that out of the way, we want to shoot at native ISO. So I'm shooting at ISO 100. That's the native ISO of my Canon. I'm shooting at f6.3, I believe. Shooting at f6.3, 1/10 of a second for my shutter speed, and ISO 100. I'm going to be able to pull the shadows up a lot and bring the highlights down, hopefully a substantial bit. I'm picking the proper exposure while my highlights still retain some details. That's something you're going to be doing a lot of when you're shooting real estate. For example, shooting for the exposure of a window, something like that. You want to expose for the brightest spot in your picture, generally for real estate. Of course, if I'm exposing for the brightest part, the rest of the picture is going to be incredibly dark. So a couple of workarounds for this is either, number one, owning a very expensive camera with ridiculous dynamic range, or number two, shooting a couple of bracketed exposures, like I'm going to show you to do right here. I'm going to pick my base exposure, where I'm exposing for the highlights. I'm going to shoot 2 stops above that to raise my shadows. Maybe sometimes you'll want to do even more. I'm pretty sure I can get away with shooting just 1 above, but just to be safe, I'm going to shoot 2 above and 2 below as well, just maybe if I'm clipping a highlight here or there, I'm safe. I'm going to kind of show you what you can expect to achieve with the minimum amount of gear I think you need to take these kind of pictures. And that's going to be just a camera, a wide angle lens. I have a cam ranger over here that's connected to an iPad, just so I can take my bracketed exposures quickly and easily, but of course you don't need that. You have the option of changing the exposure manually on your camera. Of course that's going to cause a bit of shake, but you can correct that afterwards just to align the images. If your camera has the option to take multiple bracketed exposures, I would recommend you to use that option. But over here, I'm just going to use the cam ranger. I'm going to take 5 bracketed exposures, and I'm going to show you what you can expect with this kind of setup. Alright, so the next essential piece of the pie is on-camera flash. Essentially what this helps us do is expose for the brightest part of the picture and help us lift the underexposed areas. We're not going to fire the flash directly into our room because that's going to overexpose and cause a really harsh light. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to fire this flash into the corner of the room. Luckily, our walls are grey and the ceiling is white as well, so we're not going to have a color cast problem over here. So this is a very easy room to shoot, thankfully. So we're just going to pop the flash onto the camera and shoot into the roof, see what kind of picture we get. So with the flash pictures, there are a couple of changes we're going to have to make with our exposure. I bumped the ISO to 400. Essentially what the ISO at 400 does is it increases the power of the flash. At ISO 100, our flash power was a bit too low to get the proper exposure for this underexposed area. Our bathroom was overexposed, as well as this window over here when we used our original exposure settings. So I adjusted the shutter speed just a little bit and increased our ISO to 400. So the exposure we have here is a little bit darker of an exposure than the original one we picked. However, we were able to get our picture in just 1 shot, which is amazing. There's not a lot of editing we're going to have to do with this. Maybe we'll have to straighten a couple of verticals and nothing more really. Alright, so finally, once you've wrapped your head around using on-camera flash, you might want to try something slightly more advanced. Over here I have a couple of pocket wizards. So this pocket wizard on top of my camera is triggering the pocket wizard attached to this flash and light stand. Now this gives us the option of really putting the light anywhere in the room we want to. Instead of just having the option of putting the flash on top of the camera and firing directly overhead, we can put it in any corner or any cranny of the room. I'm going to show you what kind of pictures you can achieve once you really have control of your light.
Alright, so we're finally at the editing stage of our process. Post-production on real estate can be kind of complicated sometimes, but I'll try to keep it as simple as possible over here. You'll be able to follow the hotkeys I use within Photoshop and Lightroom by looking at the bottom right corner of my screen. That'll show all the hotkeys I'm using at that moment. I'll try to explain every tool I use as I use them. But of course you can just slow down the footage and kind of look at what I'm doing and what hotkeys I'm pressing
so you can follow along maybe with your own pictures. So the first thing I want to start is just to get the basics down. I'm going to show you how to merge those exposures we used to get kind of an expensive camera feel from our cheaper cameras, where we can merge all those bracketed exposures we used into an HDR image. But don't worry, the HDR we're going to use here isn't the conventional kind of cheap looking HDR that we're used to. It's more of just a super ultimate mega raw file with a lot more dynamic range. The very first thing I like to do is, first I want to show you, I've already taken the liberty of just importing our files into a Lightroom catalog already. So the first thing I'm going to do is go down to my profile corrections or my lens corrections. The first thing we want to do is click the remove chromatic aberrations. All this does is it removes a bit of that purple fringing that we see in high contrast areas, where it goes from very dark to very bright in a small space, in few pixels. Something like this door frame where you can see there's this black lining, and then of course the window that's overexposed. So what happens is you can probably see there's just a little bit of chromatic aberration, maybe even over here on the corner of the wall. You can see some green over there. When we click that, it should remove some of it, as you can see. So it's kind of subtle, but you should be able to see. I'm not too sure if you can see it on YouTube, but I've zoomed in quite a bit over here just to show you what that does. That just kind of smooths out some of our Photoshop adjustments, especially when we're going to start combining layers. And of course, it just makes your pictures look a bit cleaner. Next I want to do is click profile corrections. What this is going to do is it's going to reduce some of the vignetting of our lenses. Generally, lenses have a bit of vignetting around the edges, so that's going to brighten those parts up a bit. And of course, it's going to remove a bit of that distortion that we get. As you can see, it's changing the position, just removing a bit of that barrel distortion that we get. Then I'm going to click sync. I want to sync all the settings apart from the white balance right now. Alright, so I'm just going to go to our bracketed exposures. It's these 5 over here. So it's 2 stops under, 1 stop under. This is kind of the exposure we picked, but of course it's a bit overexposed over here by the window and a bit overexposed in the bathroom. Then 1 stop overexposed and 2 stops overexposed. What I'm going to do is I'm going to shift click on the first one. I'm going to click the last one while holding shift. Then I'm going to click any of the images. I'm going to go to photo merge and select HDR. Lightroom does a wonderful job of already creating something that looks kind of good. Sometimes I actually just keep the auto settings, but in this instance it's still looking a bit dark in some areas, but I really like that these super overexposed areas aren't too overexposed. So let's create our super HDR raw file. All we're going to be able to do is play a lot more with our highlights, shadows and things like that to a far greater extent. And even play with the exposure slider without introducing too much noise, etc. It shouldn't take too long for your computer to create it, but sometimes with slower computers, it can take a couple of seconds up to maybe a minute or two. Hopefully that's not you. Alright, so the very first thing that's jumping out at me, of course, well, the very first thing is that I forgot the light stand in the bathroom when I took this picture. I'm going to show you how to remove that when we get into the Photoshop part of the lesson. So let's get into it. The next thing I want to do is remove this green. If you're not too experienced with pictures, you might not notice it, but this isn't what the room looked like when I was there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this eyedropper tool. And what you want is generally you really want a part of the image that's white, so you can use this image, or at least a neutral gray color. You can use to calibrate your white balance in post-production. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this ceiling, but of course sometimes there might be a part of the image that's a bit bluer than that. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to bump my white balance by maybe just 200. That may be a bit much, maybe that much. I think that's about 200. I prefer images to be a bit warmer, on the warmer side. Of course, they're meant to sell houses, so you want them to be inviting. But generally, I'm really cautious of creating bluish whites, because blue whites are very cold and uninviting. Of course, the ideal would be to have perfect white balance, but when we're running and gunning so quickly, especially in real estate photography, that's not always possible. The next thing I want to do is I really want to raise this exposure. If you look at the histogram over here, it's kind of in the middle, maybe a bit to the left. So I'm going to raise the exposure just a bit to where it's just to the left. That seems just about right. Now this is looking to be a bit too overexposed. I'm just going to reduce the highlights even more. And that looks pretty good. I'm going to take the whites down maybe just a bit. Alright, so there's still this part of the image that's kind of dark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this radial filter. Just going to make a little radial filter over here. I'm going to press invert. Now there are tons of things you can do. You can change your white balance, your contrast, but right now we're just focused on exposure. So I'm just going to increase it very slightly, like 0.17. I'm going to feather it maybe just a bit more, and that should be a very subtle change, but just increase the exposure of that part of it. This is the before and the after. So very subtle, but I really do think it's a great improvement. The next thing that really strikes me is, well, first of all, I want to change my saturation, my vibrance a bit before I get into too much more editing. Right, so our exposure looks fine to me right now. So that's kind of the first thing we want to fiddle with, is white balance and our exposure. Next thing is the clarity, the texture, the vibrance, and the saturation. The only slider I touch over here generally is the clarity. We don't want to bump this too much. All this does is it increases our mid-tone contrast, so it just adds a little bit of pop. So if you look at this plant over here, you'll kind of see what clarity does. I generally go from 10 to 15 maybe. For outdoors, I might go a bit higher. But it's up to your liking, but we don't want to go for this super HDR-ish look. If we go to full to 100, you'll see it looks like kind of this cheap HDR image. I like the vibrance over here. So all the vibrance does, it kind of increases the less saturated colors. It kind of saturates them. I like it between 10 to 20 as well. So that looks pretty good to me. And then another thing that's kind of bothering me are these creases in the bed. I'm going to take a radial filter once again. I'm going to do exactly the opposite that we just did. I'm going to reduce the clarity, invert it again so it just affects that area, and take the exposure down to 0 again, because we just want to reduce the clarity. So kind of what the clarity did is it increased the contrast in this area, and that kind of makes it a lot more obvious. This isn't too straight. We don't generally have to do this in real estate, but I'm just showing you a trick that you can use to reduce this. Of course, we can do this on the entire bed, but I'm not going to do that right now. I just wanted to do that for the purposes of showing you what you can do in this situation. So this is the before and after. As you can see, it's kind of subtle, but it definitely does the job quite well. Alright, so the very last thing I tend to do with real estate pictures is correct my verticals. My preferred method is Photoshop for this, because I have a lot more manual control. But if you want to go with the quick and dirty,
Lightroom solution, I recommend you use the manual controls. You might be tempted to use this auto or vertical setting, but generally it doesn't work perfectly, and it's a good habit to get into to just do it manually. The first thing you want to do is rotate your image. You want to look for a vertical close to the middle of your image and just rotate your image until that is kind of straight. So let's go to rotate. Alright, I can see this image is rotated a bit, so I'm just going to do that. So this looks pretty good to me right now. I mean, my verticals seem to be pretty straight, but if you tilted your camera up or down, you can use this vertical setting to tilt the image to your liking, or I mean perfectly. The final thing I'm going to do is click constrain crop, and that's going to crop my image. I don't think it cropped it totally. It doesn't seem to have cropped it totally, so I'm just going to do it manually. Alright, that seems pretty good. Alright, so that's our final image. Everything is complete. I'm just going to toggle between them for you in full screen mode. So that's kind of before and after. So that looks pretty good, and this is perfectly deliverable for any real estate agent. They'll definitely be satisfied with this work. The next thing we want to do is go to our first flash exposure. So if you have on-camera flash, this is kind of what you can expect from that. As you can see, this light is super flash compared to maybe one of our ambient exposures. The light is coming directly from the camera, so we want to composite this with an ambient exposure just to add a bit of depth. And then, of course, I want to remove some of this flash from the light and maybe brighten over there as well, because the flash doesn't seem to have reached over there. And the rest of the image looks pretty good. I mean, for one flash, this looks like a pretty good image. I mean, you can probably deliver this image to a real estate agent and they'd be happy, but we're just going to go the extra mile. I'm going to take one stop overexposed and my correct exposure and merge that with my flash exposure. Set my white balance. So this looks pretty good to me already. I'm just going to warm it up just a little bit, maybe like 100. And I'm going to, of course, I didn't set the white balance for these. I just set the white balance for the HDR, so I have to do these again as well. So I'm just going to raise that just a bit. Alright, that seems pretty good. Pretty good. So I'm just going to flag these. I'm going to remove the flag from this HDR image we have. Let's go to flagged. Let's just make sure we have chromatic aberrations enabled on everything, because we're going to be toying with these. I'm going to shift click all of them, right click on any one of them, edit in, and open as layers in Photoshop. Now sometimes what I do like to do is maybe raise the shadows or decrease the highlights just a bit, so I have a bit more dynamic range to play with. But right now I don't think I'm going to do that. I just want the image to be as clean as possible and not fiddle with the highlights and shadows slider too much. Alright, so now that we have all our images loaded into Photoshop, all we can do is, just to make sure they're all aligned, I know mine are probably aligned because I use the Cam Ranger, but we can just shift click all of them, click the top one, shift click the bottom one, click edit, and then auto align layers. This does a pretty good job of aligning our pictures. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide this overexposed layer. I'm going to put it at the top. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select the correct exposure, that layer, this little icon over here. I'm going to alt click that, and that should create a layer mask. Next, I'm going to press the B key for our brush. I'm going to make it a bit smaller, an opacity of about 30%. I'm just going to brush over this gently to reduce some of that flash. What we can do now is shift left click on this layer mask that we created, just to see kind of what parts of the ambient exposure we like. So this image is kind of flat. This looks very flashy, so I just want to add a bit of ambient shadows over there, and then also I kind of like the light seeping through here from the bathroom. I'm going to add some of that, and then finally I just want to add a bit of texture to this bed, a bit of depth. I think that looks pretty good. Yeah, I'm kind of liking that. Alright, the final thing I want to do is a neat little trick. I'm just going to use this overexposed image. I'm going to do the same, alt click, create a layer mask, maybe on like 20%. So I'm just going to press 2 for 20% of opacity on the brush. We're going to press B for brush again. I'm just going to brush in a little bit of that overexposed image, just to brighten up that underexposed part of our image. Maybe it's a bit too bright, so I'm just going to reduce the opacity of it, maybe to 80%. And that's looking pretty good. Now I want to drag out a couple of guides just to see what my verticals look like. So I'm dragging out quite a bit, quite a couple of them. You don't really need this many. As we can see, most of them are leaning to the left. I'm going to merge all these images into one layer by pressing Ctrl Shift Alt E. That merges everything into one layer. I'm going to select Edit, Transform, and Rotate. And we're going to do exactly the same thing we did in Lightroom, just in Photoshop. So, I mean, they're leaning to the right a bit. Alright, so that looks just about right. Just going to rotate it a bit. And to show and hide your guides, you just press Control semicolon. What I'm going to do next is I'm just going to crop away these pixels. It seems like it wasn't perfectly aligned. I'm just going to crop away those pixels. You can choose any aspect ratio that suits your image, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to use the original ratio. So I'm just going to crop just a little bit. Generally, we don't want to crop our pictures too much because it's really going to reduce the quality. We want to avoid doing that and kind of get the best pictures in field and get the composition we want. I mean, I'm not cropping a lot here, it's just to remove that excess. Alright, so that's looking pretty good. I'm going to press Enter. With key, and of course to crop you press C. I kind of forgot to say that, but you can see it here at the bottom right, what keys I'm pressing. So what we're going to do now is press on File and then Save As. I want to choose PSD. So if we save it here, it's going to be in the same library as the Lightroom catalog. But generally what I like to do is create a master folder or a Photoshop folder and just save it in the Photoshop folder. So we can save our PSD. It should be automatically imported into Lightroom. Minimize, go to library, should be imported over here in just a sec. Alright, so we can see we have this new folder with our PSD. I'm just going to do a couple of finishing touches on this PSD. Maybe want to reduce the highlights just a bit. Increase the vibrance once again to about 15. Saturation maybe 5. And increase the clarity to about 7. So we can see we kind of got the same result. This is at it's leaning toward the right of our histogram, which is what we tend to want. So we know we did a pretty good job. Of course, what the picture looks like at the end is most important. I think I'm just going to move this HDR image to our Photoshop folder as well, just so we can compare them. Let's compare these images. So this is the HDR and this is the Photoshop. I kind of prefer the Photoshop one. I think it looks a lot more professional. So now for the final image, we're going to use our flash exposures. And not to get confused by all these new files, I'm just going to flag the images I want to use. I'm going to do kind of the same thing again. I'm just going to mark my flash images. So this is the flash is coming from this side. You can see the flash pop is very harsh over there, but there's a bit more depth in the picture, which I really like, because the flash isn't coming from the same side as the camera. The image isn't as flat. But again, we have this problem of this darker part. We could have fixed that by adding another flash over here, but just to keep the tutorial simple, I'm just going to use another ambient layer once again. And then of course we want to use this flash that we used inside the bathroom. You can see there's a bit of light leaking over here that looks really cool. So let's go to flagged. We're just going to see our flagged pictures. Of course, we've already flagged these two. So what I'm going to do now is, once again, I've already set the white balance for my normal pictures. So I really want to get the white balance for the outside, because I want this to merge seamlessly with the floor. I'm going to click over there, maybe raise it just a bit, maybe by 200, and have kind of the same white balance over here. And then of course we've already done the white balance for our ambient layers. Shift click once more, right click on any of the pictures and click open as layers in Photoshop. Alright, so what we're going to do again is just shift click all the layers and auto align layers. With this flash exposure, we're actually trying to mimic the natural light. As you can see, a lot of the light is coming from this side. If you look at these drawers over here, with the light coming from this side, it looks a lot more three-dimensional. And the light looks a lot better, so I think this is going to be our main flash layer. And this is our bathroom flash. I'm just zooming in by pressing Z. Alright, this is our overexposed and ambient or correct exposure, whatever you want to name that. So the first thing I want to do is include this little bathroom layer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select the lasso tool by pressing L. I'm going to circle around it, and then I'm going to click on this layer mask. I can see this looks kind of weird. We obviously don't want it to look like this. So all we're going to do is click lighten. Now we don't even have the problem of this being too prevalent, this light stand, but we're still going to have to fix that just a bit. As you can see, it blended this layer seamlessly. Of course, I said I wanted to include some of that light spillage. So I'm just going to take a brush at 30% opacity, white, add some of that as well. Alright, so I kind of want to deal with this overexposed area. All I'm going to do is select the pen tool by pressing P. Just go over this room. Alright, so press Ctrl Enter to create a layer mask with your closed path, and then press Shift F6 to feather your selection. This is just to smoothen the edges, so it isn't so obvious that we used selection to brush over here. I generally like to use feather by 1 pixel. Press OK, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just with a black brush, set it maybe 40% opacity. I'm just going to brush out some of this overexposed, just where the flash popped. That's looking a lot better. So far this image is looking quite good already. So the next thing I want to do is select this ambient. Once again, I'm going to alt click, create layer mask, So of course I want to paint in over here, maybe a bit in the light because it's flashy as well. With a brush of about 40% again, I'm just going to brush in. Whoops, it's black. We press X just to make it black or white. Make sure you're on the layer mask when you're brushing as well. I'm just going to take a fairly big brush, just brush out this very bright flash pop. We can see what that did. Pretty subtle. We just want to fix that area. The next thing I want to fix is this light, maybe on about 30%. Oops. Looks like the light rotated a bit. So I think I'm just going to leave that light. What we can do as well is maybe go to 100%. The ceilings generally look quite good on ambient layers. So we can see it didn't make that much of a difference. Right, so I'm still kind of liking the flash layer up here. I think I can paint it in just subtly, maybe at about 30%. I can just brush this out. Whoops. Make sure it's set to black. Just going to brush past, making sure to avoid the light. And that looks pretty good. Alright, now the final thing I want to do is brighten up this part once more. So I'm just going to select the overexposed layer, make it visible. Alt click again. And what I'm going to do is that with the brush of about 20% again, I'm just going to fairly big. I'm just sort of gonna make it a bit brighter. That looks pretty good. Maybe with an opacity of about 60%. That's kind of too bright. Maybe like 50. And that looks pretty good to my eye. Alright, so the final thing I kind of want to show you is how to remove this light stand. So once again, we're going to take our pen tool, just kind of go around that area. Alright, we're going to press Control Enter again, Shift F6, and what we're going to do is go to our spot healing brush tool, create a new layer, click on wherever we see this light stand is, and it should do a pretty good job of clearing that up. Still have a little piece that I don't want there. It can be quite tedious sometimes. This isn't completely straight. Maybe use the clone stamp tool. Use the clone stamp tool as well, just to make sure it's straight. It doesn't look like we can do it. That seems pretty fine. I mean, once we're back here, you're not going to notice that. So that's pretty good. It's pretty damn good. You're definitely not going to notice that little piece over there when they're all the way zoomed out. Especially not on real estate websites. But the final thing we want to do is, once again, we want to correct our verticals. Alright, we're going to select all our layers, press Shift Alt Control E, select Edit, Transform, Skew, whoops, no, Edit, Transform, Rotate, sorry. Just want to rotate just a bit. That looks pretty good. Alright, so let's compare our images that we've imported. Right, let's start with the HDR image. Perfectly deliverable, pretty cool image. Might be a bit green still to my liking. This is the first flash shot. I think it's better than the HDR one. It's just a bit flat because we're using that on-camera flash. And then finally we have our 2-flash image. It looks a lot less flat to me. Overall, I much prefer this image. So as you can see, you can get perfectly deliverable results no matter what your gear. Make sure you like and subscribe if you want to see more real estate photography tips and Photoshop tutorials. I have been Francois. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.